Picture it. Borger, Texas, 1983. I'm a 10-year-old boy standing in the First Baptist Church. I went there with my best friend at the time, Casey. His parents had attended this wealthy and very popular Southern Baptist congregation since well before either of us were born. It was much fancier than my grandparents' humble, independent Baptist church up the road. So I was really excited that Casey invited me for the final weekend of Vacation Bible School. It was, after all, the event for any 10-year-old living in the small town of Borger. I had a great time. We sang, laughed, ran around the large campus playing hide and seek, and ate lots of homemade ice cream. As was the tradition, and I suspect still is, been a while since I've been in a Baptist church, the close of the weekend was Sunday morning worship. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Baptist faith, but it is normally the practice to end every fire and brimstone sermon with something called an altar call. This is the time in the service where you're supposed to have been so emotionally and spiritually inspired by the preacher that you get up, walk to the front of the sanctuary, and after a short prayer, your complete sinfulness is washed away and you become born again, refreshed in the love of God, which of course is only available through your acceptance of Jesus, the Redeemer. Making sure you're still here. The belief that we are inherently unworthy and in fact are totally deprived is a theology largely created by the Protestant reformer and fantastic partygoer, John Calvin. Sounds like a riot. He and his followers believed that due to our sinful nature, the loving grace of God was available only through the exclusive acceptance of his son, Jesus. Some Baptists, like the Southern Baptist Church of Borger back then, accepted and promoted this Calvinistic form of redemption. But our faith, Unitarian Universalism, has long since rejected such notions. Here in America, we can attribute the rejection of Calvinism to Universalist ministers like Hosea Ballou. We can see in the story of his own baptism, his transformation, a transformation that went from Calvinism and its promotion all the way to what we now know as Universalism. I tried to reimagine his baptism. Maybe you can go there with me now. The words of the fiery Baptist preachers at the revival inspired Hosea to make his way forward to the edge of the river. Held by the preachers, Hosea entered the water. He embraced the frigid liquid and was immersed underwater for a brief second before being raised back into the light. He was a newly minted Baptist believer, born again. Hosea would go on to enter the Baptist ministry alongside his father, preaching the importance of Calvinism. Now, I can guess that Hosea may have felt a little similar to me when I became born again at kneeling at the altar of the First Baptist Church in Borger. I felt, at least that time, it took a few times for Jesus to listen. Sometimes I think he's still listening. That I could forget my 10-year-old sins and start all over again. What sins does a 10-year-old have? Unfortunately for both Hosea and me, the theology of Calvinism was very off-putting and really wouldn't last. While it isn't known what brought Hosea to seek redemption on the day of his baptism, history has documented fully how he spent the 6 months after his conversion in studying the Bible. He studied it a lot, and then went on to debate, mostly with Universalist ministers, the merits of Calvinism compared to Universalism. That is until he met Universalist minister Caleb Rich, whose universalist message really got under the skin of Hosea and caused a crisis of faith. Ultimately, Hosea converts from Calvinism and being a Baptist to becoming one of our fathers of American Universalism. Our Universalist ancestry claims not only that we are all full of worth and dignity right now as we are sitting in this room, but that our lives are deeply entangled to one another. I believe this is the good news of our faith. Good news we don't promote well. The good news is that we do not need to look toward the heavens for a resurrected Redeemer called Jesus. Instead, we look at Jesus' way of life as redeeming, not simply his death and possible resurrection. We no longer seek a Redeemer to save us, but instead, through our honoring of one another's inherent worth and dignity, and the building of deep, authentic relationships that honor our interconnectedness, we become one another's redeemers. In the spirit of the Baptist faith, I invite you to turn to your neighbor right now and ask one another without response, will you be my redeemer? In true Unitarian Universalist behavior, I feel like some of you have started a dialogue with one another, which is okay, it's part of our faith. But how did that feel for you? Was it comfortable, or did you feel some discomfort? Could you feel the assumed weight of those words? Perhaps you had a moment like the birds from today's story for all ages. They looked into the lake and had the awakening that they were one another's redeemer. And I think what is strong about that story is not only were they each other's redeemer, but they were redeemed. They made it over the mountain together. I think that's amazing. I believe that this is true in our communities as well. We will not only redeem one another, but we ourselves can be redeemed. And if that doesn't sit well with you, then maybe the English translation of today's Spanish hymn is more to your ringing of your ear. Seek out the love in you. It only grows whenever it is shared. If we are one another's redeemer, then we have to start acting like it. Over the past several years, our faith has attempted to recognize and honor the diversity that has been present since the creation of the Unitarian and the Universalist faiths well before their merger. This has caused a lot of angst and frustration by some of our members within the UU world. I've heard phrases like political correctness, identity politics, and language policing used at coffee hours, online communities, and in small group settings in several different spaces that I travel. I have a friend whose pronouns are they. As a cisgendered male, I had a choice to make when my friend initially asked me to use those pronouns. I could explain how grammatically awkward it was for me to use those words in that way, or I could lean into my role as redeemer for myself and others and hold the request as higher than my feelings. Truth be told, it cost me nothing to be kind and compassionate, and in fact, I believe the tenets of our faith requires it of us. Similarly, when my friends of color tell me Black Lives Matter, my redeeming response cannot be all lives matter. That response has more to do with my own feelings, maybe my discomfort with language again, or perhaps my perceived threat of erasure as a white male. But maybe, just maybe, it sparks pangs of discomfort about my own involvement in perpetuating systemic oppression. In any case, lifting up groups that have been so mistreated and marginalized by this country and, yes, this faith, is a very important act to heal our collective past. In these situations, I'm reminded of the words of our former president of the UU Seminary, Meadville Lombard, Reverend Lee Barker, who said, in those moments when he encounters that internal conflict and duress, he asks himself, is it more important to be right in this moment or to be in relationship? Right? Yeah, that's good. Neuroscientists have documented and researched the importance of such relationships. They're important to our emotional and psychological health as humans. One such study demonstrated clear advantages to the learning of children when the children were actually allowed themselves to teach one another instead of just learning through rote memorization. The act of engaging with another person in teaching, in this study's case, lights up the pro-social areas of the brain. The benefits were measurable on the students who taught. They, in fact, learned the material better when the goal was to teach someone else. I really see this study and others like it as an acknowledgement that there is a power beyond our own individuality. I believe that this is the core of our faith. I see it reflected by this past year's General Assembly when UU congregations all over the world met in Spokane, Washington. We were asked at that assembly, some of you were there, about what is at the core of our faith. What was meant by the convention's theme, the power of we? As we are a living religious tradition that changes over time, it is our practice to routinely evaluate the principles. This year's upcoming General Assembly in Providence will take on that task. In preparation, our congregations will be asked in the next few months to have working meetings to attempt to review our principles and the underlying core beliefs that bind them. We will be asked to think about what is at the center of this thing we call our faith. What draws us to one another? What kept you here when I was talking about salvation through Jesus? Please be on the lookout for those breakout sessions. Your perspective and voice is needed. These types of gatherings, our Sunday worship, the things we do throughout the week, are all part of this deeply covenantal religion. A covenant is based on relationships. And this is a time in our country and world history where, as Susan Frederick Gray, the president of our UUA, says, it is not time for a casual faith. And I really felt that today in Caitlin's opening words to us, that relationships are active and engaging, and if we really want to redeem ourselves and others, then complacency is our collective enemy. I am no longer that 10-year-old child waiting for Jesus to save me. Instead, I'm waiting for you. And I hope you're waiting for me. For me, understanding that we are each other's redeemers is a way to honor our religious ancestors like Jesus, Hosea Ballou, and others. Now, we are not Calvinists. I'm not inviting you up to the altar at the end of this service. Instead, as our final hymn is played in the background, I invite us to again turn to one another, and this time, deeply honor our faith and each other by connecting to your neighbor and saying, we are our redeemers.